But if you will look in your 3-ring binder, right after the kind of cover page, there is an outline of where we're going to be in this whole series. So let me just hit a couple of the high points there, because we're going to be doing our last session tonight on the existence of God, morality. And then after we do a couple sessions that won't be recorded for the next 2 weeks out of the Truth Project, we're going to look at the first of 2 sessions on creation versus evolution. And in one of those 2 sessions, Marilyn, we're going to come back and deal with carbon dating and just how precise and how detailed and how accurate it is. So we'll spend some time with that, and by the time we're finished, you'll be able to calculate half-life. I am definitely lying. That is true. You'll be wrong as all the experts. That's a good point. And then the rest of this session 1 will be a general introduction to the Bible, inspiration of the Bible, what does God expect of me in the church. Then when we get to, hold on one second here, let me grab this. When we get to our second round of apologetics, we're going to come back to a couple of things at some point. It will probably not be until the very end of, well, it won't be until the very end of session of the 201 class, which we'll do in the fall. And we're going to come back again a little bit to creation versus evolution in the last 2 parts. But this is a little more detailed. You'll see it's called kind of an intermediate session. And it's going to deal with some things that we've all wondered about, like Satan, origin and mission, evil, pain, and suffering, some of those, some of the easy subjects. And then once we finish that, we'll probably finish out the fall. I suspect we'll finish out the fall with session 3, 301. And again, we'll deal with the easy things like origin, random chance, or intelligent design. And then I suspect we'll have quite a bit about Genesis 1 through 11, mythical or historical. And then you can see some of the rest of the categories, dinosaurs, science, and the Bible. That's where we're going to be until we finish up probably towards the end of the fall of this coming year. So that's kind of where we're headed for the near and short-term future. Tonight we're going to finish up with the existence of God and morality. And I was telling Dale, and I shared this with Marilyn earlier as well, I struggle mightily with this session, and I'll tell you why. The cosmological argument, remember the cosmological argument is simply that there is a universe, and we have discussed how the universe had a beginning. If the universe had a beginning, it had to have a beginner, right? And then we dealt with the teleological argument, which is the universe shows evidence of design, right? So therefore, there had to be a designer. So I could make at least some sense out of an evolutionist argument for both of those. I cannot make heads or tails out of a rational argument for how evolution or how morality could possibly have evolved. And you're going to see that tonight. So if you see me struggling, don't hesitate to raise your hand and say, I know the answer to that. Didn't struggle with the issue of we have morality because the Creator gave us morality. I struggled with the issue of how does morality evolve? And you'll see that as we get a little bit further into it. So let's start. We'll be on page 1 of session 4. By the way, you all should have notes, and we'll use those notes quite a bit that Deborah handed out. And the first thing we should probably note is this. Everyone in the world believes that some things are right and some things are wrong. Thus, every person has some system of morality and ethics. Now you might say, well, how does this develop, or how does this all come about? And I found some interesting, we're going to look at a couple of interesting things I found on the internet, which everyone knows is 100% true. So anything you find on the internet, feel free to share with everyone as the absolute truth. This one I researched a couple of different places. Yale University, and they have what's called an infant cognition center. And they took 6 to 10-month-old babies and showed them videos. They were cognizant enough to understand not understand, but could see what a video was. And this particular video showed a circle struggling to get up a hill. And then, I think it was a yellow circle. I don't know if the colors make any difference. And then a red square came and helped push the yellow circle up to the top of the hill. And then a red triangle came and pushed the circle down the hill violently. So these are 6 and 10-month-olds. After that, the researchers went around to the 6 and 10-month-old, and they had on a tray a circle, a square, and a triangle. And guess what? They threw the triangle away. None of them would pick the circle or the square, and none of them picked the triangle. Now, is that a sign of ethics? Is that a sign of morals? Is that a sign that we're built with something to know the difference between right and wrong? Well, the evolutionist is going to say, see, if that hadn't evolved, that never would have happened. They never make the case that, well, couldn't it possibly have been that we were wired that way by a creator? So when does this all occur? I'm going to make the case that it occurs as soon as you're knit in the womb and has been there by the creator. I'd like to say that's what atheists believe as well, but unfortunately we already know that that's not going to be true. So now let's deal with first the moral law argument. And this is what's called a syllogism. And a syllogism basically has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Here is a syllogism for the moral law argument. Every law has a lawgiver. Anybody differ with that? We have a bunch of lawgivers. Seems like all we really have right now are lawgivers in this country, one way or another. I'm not saying they have good lawgivers. I'm saying we have lawgivers. So if every law has a lawgiver, and if we say there is a moral law, therefore there has to be a moral lawgiver. Now, further, if there are moral obligations, there must be someone to be obligated to. So that's the syllogism we're going to look at, but then we're going to bump into this issue as we get a little further into it. Let me...
Tom, one of our problems is a lot of our lawgivers today are lawbreakers also.
Good point. Dale?
The atheists, we have the law of gravity, we have the laws of thermodynamics. Who do they say is the lawgiver? They don't.
They say there is no lawgiver. First of all, they say there is no moral law.
Yeah.
So they disagree with the whole syllogism, right? So...
Keep going, you're good. I had the same question as Dale.
Yeah. And we'll probably get to that, to the point that you guys are headed towards, I think, here. If we don't, bring me back to it. So let's start out with a little bit about two things. First, morality. Morality comes from the Latin word mores, and by the way, this is in your notes as well, meaning habits or customs. So morality, therefore, is the habit of following the rules of proper conduct. Ethics is from a Greek word meaning character. So the standard dictionary definition of ethics is the discipline dealing with what is good and bad, or right and wrong, a group of moral principles or a set of values. So Morals and ethics deal with the proper conduct, duty, and virtue, or, in short, how we ought to behave. The question now there before us is, how should we behave? Well, in concepts such as good and evil, right and wrong do exist, if they do exist. How do we go about determining whether a particular thing is right or wrong? Everyone agrees that some things are right and other things are wrong. Morals and ethics are universally accepted traits among the human family. You'll find them everywhere. So therefore, the origin must be explained. If it's found everywhere in mankind, where does it come from? Simply put, there are only two options. Either morality and ethics originate from the mind of God, who is the source of all goodness, or they originate from within man himself. Now, I want to leap ahead to session 5, because there's a quote by Charles Darwin that I think you need to hear. Darwin said that and this is a quote, natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad and preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. How does the organic being know what's bad and what's good? How is it that we began this process, according to Darwin, of understanding what's bad and what's good? Dale?
That's even scientifically inaccurate. Because all mutations are a loss of information, not a gain of new information. So in that sense, because we are subject to the second law of thermodynamics, man is continually to devolve.
That's exactly right. So wait a minute, Dale, I got to make sure I'm understanding this. Are you saying that Darwin has errors in his theory?
You know what, I didn't always used to think that. That's what's surprising to me.
Yeah.
Is that I used to think of directed evolution. I used to believe that. That's unbelievable now.
Yeah, that's right, Dale. That's right, Dale. You've evolved. Good job, Dale. Now, the person who refuses to recognize the existence of God has only one choice when it comes to explaining morality. It must have originated within man. However, since man is viewed as little more than the last animal produced in a long, meandering chance process of evolution, this becomes a problem, doesn't it? A lion, now I want you to think about this for just a minute. What if you had to say, if somebody said to you, what is the primary thought of Darwin's theory? Deb? Wouldn't you say survival of the fittest?
No,
What would you say?
he never said that.
You know, whether he said it or not, would you not say that most people would say that's the concept, survival of the fittest?
Most people believe, yes, that is the concept.
But his expanded title lets you know that that's not what he was doing. That's not what he was trying to, he was actually a racist.
Sure, he was justifying.
Justifying what he wanted to believe. Well, the point being that the process would have had to have been a meandering chance process of evolution, and this becomes a problem when you think about it. A lion is not plagued by guilt after killing a gazelle for its meat. A dog does not experience remorse after stealing a bone from another dog. Yet man was also, who also is supposed to have evolved, feels both guilt and remorse. Why would he feel guilt and remorse when other animals do not? By the way, we're going to come to a list of animals, when we talk about ethics, of animals that prey on their own kind. And if one would have to ask the question, if morals evolved, why did they not evolve uniformly? If they all came from one point, why did they not evolve uniformly? So we'll come back to that here in a minute. Richard Dawkins, who most of you will recognize as probably at least the most famous evolutionist, maybe in the world, but until he died, was in Great Britain. He once admitted that believing in evolution and then acting consistently upon that belief would produce a very nasty society in which to live. So his conclusion is, if we follow evolution to its logical conclusion, none of these things can happen. It would be a very nasty society. Matter by itself does not have the power to evolve any sense of moral consciousness. If there's no purpose in the universe, which is the position evolution are forced to take, then there's no purpose in morality or ethics. Are you following me? What's the purpose of morality and ethics? If there's no purpose in the universe, if we are born, we evolve, we die, and that's it, what's the purpose of morality? Why would there be one? Dostoevsky, when he wrote Brothers Karamazov, yes, you know, the Rushki stuff, had one of the lines in his book. It says, if there is no God, everything is permitted. Oh, how true. If evolution is correct, and there is no God, people can do anything they want. Thus, it's impossible to formulate any system of ethics by which one can tell the difference between right and wrong. Furthermore, if I develop a system of ethics, what's to say that my system of ethics is better than your system of ethics, or your system of ethics, or your system of ethics?
But don't they subscribe to as long as that doesn't hurt anybody else, it's okay? Is that their ethic?
To some degree, yeah.
Of course, people violate that, but that's the general.
So then one has to ask the question, okay, what does hurt someone mean? Right?
And why should you care?
And that's right, and why should you care?
Well, that's why murder is considered wrong even by an atheist, because you hurt somebody.
Well, and that I agree with, but how is it they know it's wrong? Because it developed? It evolved within them to know it's wrong? You see why I struggled there? Jerry?
I had a pastor friend up in Longmont who, in World War II, was at the Battle of the Bulge. He got wounded. Later on, they gave him a job driving the vehicle for General Patton. He was with Patton when they liberated a bunch of the Nazi death camps. And he heard them interviewing some of these German guards and saying, did you think what you were doing was right? And these guards admitted that they knew it was wrong. They did it because they were afraid of what would happen to them if they didn't do it. And some of the American soldiers said, well, if you think it was right to do that, why don't we just shoot you? You know, would it be right if we shot you because you just killed the Jews? And they stood there with their mouths hanging. They realized, no, it would not be right. So even the Nazis that killed 6 million Jews, they knew what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah, there's a difference between knowing what you're doing is wrong and somehow that process evolving to where you know what's wrong. But all of society has a standard of what is right and what is wrong. Murder is one of them.
Well, Eve was told not to take the fruit off the tree, and Adam. And they both took it off, or Adam took it off, or Eve did. But there was a consequence
For actions, that's right.
for the rest of their life.
By the way, if you want to know where we first encounter guilt in the Bible, that's probably it. What is guilt?
Where was that?
Adam and Eve.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I was thinking of Cain and Abel.
Which comes first, Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel? But take your pick. Either one of those is okay with me. Now, with no way to reach a rational conclusion on what's ethical, man finds himself in kind of slippery slope in a sea of despair where might makes right and where the strong crushes the weak, where each man does what is right in his own eyes. Didn't we just finish studying Judges about that very issue? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Morals and ethics without God is not a pretty picture. And I've got some examples here that they give us in the book of at least 5 different systems of man trying to find a way to explain their actions or their morality. The first is called relativism. I've got 5 of them, all 5 of them up here. I may have even put them in your notes, but let me just hit the high points of these. Relativism, for example, says there's no universal rules for determining morals or ethics. Now, according to relativism, by the way, we're on page 2, if a society wants to kill all children 8 years old or younger as a means of population control, no one could say legitimately that it's wrong to do so. However, all humans know that some things are right and other things are wrong. A relativist says there is no guideline. The hedonist, Marilyn and I were talking about this earlier. A hedonist is the philosophy, or hedonism, which claims that the aim of moral conduct is to achieve the greatest possible pleasures with the least amount of pain. Utilitarianism is the system of belief which suggests that good is determined by what produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. In other words, if everyone, let's say from here over, decides that what's going to give us the most pleasure or what's the best for all of us is to wipe out these 2 over here, guess what happens to these 2? Sorry guys, you just don't get a choice. Yeah. Ixnay, you're out of here. This is one of my favorites. Situationism or situationalism is the idea that something is right because a person decides it is right in any given instance, in a particular circumstance. According to this philosophy, there's nothing that always is right or always is wrong. Each individual situation determines the correctness of its actions. You know what I hear time and time again from people, and, well, not all people, but some people? Well, that may be your truth, but it's not my truth. I got news for you. There's only one truth. This is situationalism. It's not true for me because I am in this particular point. Well, that just doesn't make sense. Now, on the contrary, some things always are right and some things are always wrong. The situationist is not a worthwhile philosophy because it cannot deal with moral absolutes that are recognized by all humans as both legitimate and necessary. Furthermore, when 2 people find themselves in a sticky situation and one wants to do one thing while the other wants to do something entirely different, who's right? Who gets to determine which is right? Without any system of absolutes, who gets to choose? Johnsons, are you telling a story here that?
I think Janice just said she is.
Yeah, well,
I was just affirming that.
Yeah. Start ahead.
never confuse situationism with matrimony. Marriage is outside of this discussion, right? Okay.
I was gonna say, who wins is whoever is the strongest personality of the 2, and who might makes right?
There you go. Right. And then the final one, I may even put it up here. No, I didn't, but I will. Determinism. I wrote it in my notes here to share with you. This is called the Flip Wilson theory. All right, thanks, Marie. For those, everybody in this room should know who Flip Wilson is. You know, if we were next door, we'd have a slightly different audience. So you remember Flip Wilson always said, The devil made me do it. Well, determinism is the idea that man is not really responsible for his action. This belief claims that the long evolutionary process has instilled in man certain instincts that determine his actions. For example, if a person steals something, who's responsible? Determinism would claim that this evolutionary past is responsible, or that his genes made him do it. Yet, common sense tells us that every rational person is responsible for his own actions. Otherwise, why would we bother having laws, police, courts, judges, or jails? Now,
when I lived in Spain, Madrid, Spain, back in 1958, 59, the Spanish believed that they could steal or tell you a lie, and it was only a sin if you caught them at it.
well, I think that's accurate.
I get in a taxi driver in a taxi and I hand him a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I gave him a cigarette and asked him to drive safely.
And did he?
Language, no. Got to that plaza and that horn just honked as he just kept on going.
So now let's go back, and from this point on, you'll probably need to be in your notes. I want to go back to this question of, the first question is there such a thing as a moral law? You know, our syllogism said there is a moral law. Well, is there such a thing as a moral law? So let's deal a little bit with that. Is it really true that there's a moral law? And we're going to be using my best bud here, who knows me, I'm sure, by first name by now, Norman Geisler. Is it really true that there's a moral law? Well, founding fathers thought so. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is nature's law, and he says it is self-evident. You don't need to discover it. It's right there. It's in front of you. When we say moral law exists, we mean that all people are impressed with fundamental sense of right and wrong. There's a University of Texas at Austin professor who said, everyone knows certain principles. There is no land where murder is virtue and gratitude a vice. In other words, everyone knows there are absolute moral obligations. An absolute moral obligation is something that is binding on all people at all times in all places. And an absolute moral law implies an absolute moral law giver. Now, I want to look at some reasons why that's true. And I listed them in your notes as well. There are 8 of them. I'm only going to look at 4 of them. The 8, you'll see, I don't know what page it's got to be. Well, there's only 2 pages in the notes, so it's got to be in there somewhere. There's 8 of them. I'm going to look at 4 of them. The moral law is undeniable. We know it by our reactions. It is unchanging. It is the unchanging standard of justice. And since we know what's absolutely wrong, there must be an absolute standard of rightness. To your point, Jerry, about the guards knew what they were doing wrong. If they knew they were doing wrong, what did they have to know? What was right?
One of the interesting things about living in Germany for 4 years, I thought, how could a country that gave us Luther, Beethoven, intelligent people, creative people, how could they do something like that? Well, they hid it from their own people. Those camps were, now some of the Germans claimed they didn't know they were there, but I have doubts about that. But they did, and anybody that opposed what they were doing, the Nazis put them in prison.
Yeah.
So there were people in Germany that knew that was wrong. I would say probably the majority of the people knew it was wrong.
But did nothing about it.
They couldn't do anything about it.
So let's look at these 4. First, moral law is undeniable. Relativists usually make 2 primary truth claims. The first is this: there is no absolute truth. I want you to think about that for a minute. And the second is there is no absolute moral value. Well, think about it for just a minute. To defuse the first claim, if there really is no absolute truth, then their absolute claim that there's no absolute truth can't be true. Do you follow me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And like absolute truth, absolute values are also undeniable. While the claim there are no absolute values is not self-defeating, the existence of absolute values is practically undeniable. In other words, in practice, they are undeniable. And Geisler does a great example of this. For the person who denies all values, values his right to deny them. Do you see my point? If I say there are no values, my value is there are no values. Do you see what I mean? It's self-defeating. Further, he wants everyone to value him as a person, even while he denies that there are no values for all persons. And he gives this example, which I think is a great one. He and Frank Turek, who wrote the book, were doing a session, and they made this point. And he said, after I suggested such a thing as objective moral values, to which we all have obligations, one lady stood and protested loudly, there are no real values. It's all a matter of taste or opinion. I resisted the temptation to make my point by shouting, sit down and shut up, you egghead. Who wants to hear your opinion? What was he doing? He was proving to her what she just said could not be true. Her complaint would have proved that she actually did believe in real absolute value. She valued her right to say that there are no absolute values. In other words, even those who deny all values nevertheless value their right to make that denial. Are you following me here? And therein lies the inconsistency. Moral values are practically undeniable. In other words, in practice, morals and values, you can't make the case that they don't exist or that there are no such thing without making the case that there is such a thing. Let me give you the second one. Our reactions help us discover the moral law, right from wrong. This is another good example that he uses. There was an ethics professor, he didn't tell where, an ethics professor assigned a term paper to his students. And he told the students to write on any ethical topic they wanted to. They were unhampered by whatever it was. And he requiring each student only to properly back up his or her thesis with reason and documentation. One student, an atheist, wrote eloquently on the topic of moral relativism. He argued, and this is quoting, all morals are relative. There is no absolute standard of justice or rightness. It's all a matter of opinion. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. The professor graded the paper. He gave it an F. And on the cover of the paper he wrote, F, I don't like blue folders. You can tell where this is going, right? So the student got the paper back, and he pounds on the door of the professor, and he runs into his office and he protests, F, I don't like blue folders. That's not fair. That's not right. That's not just. You didn't grade the paper on its merits. Raising his hand to quiet the bombastic student, the professor calmly retorted, wait a minute, hold on. I read a lot of papers, let me see. Wasn't yours the paper that said there is no such thing as fairness, rightness, and justice? Yes, the student answered. Then what's this you say about me not being fair, right, and just? The professor asked. Didn't your paper argue that it's all a matter of taste? You like chocolate, I like vanilla. Well, the moral of the story is that there are absolute morals. Here the student realized there is an objective standard of rightness by how he reacted to the professor's treatment of him. In the same way, I may not think stealing is wrong when I steal from you, but watch how morally outraged I get when you steal from me. So the second argument, or the second point is, our reactions help us discover the moral law, right from wrong. Is everybody with me so far? Let me give you the third. Without the moral law, we couldn't know justice or injustice. Perhaps the most popular argument against the existence of God is the presence and persistence of evil in the world. If there really is good and just God, then why does he allow bad things to happen to good people? Atheists have long asserted that it would be more logical to believe that this God doesn't exist than to try and explain how evil and God cannot coexist. By the way, we're going to come back and address this in one of the sessions. I think it's in the intermediate section that we do. C.S. Lewis wrote this: as an atheist, my argument against God, which he was, by the way, C.S. Lewis was an atheist, argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? By the way, this is one of the realizations that turned C.S. Lewis to Christianity. Lewis, like you and me, can only detect injustice because there's an unchanging standard of justice. Let me summarize it here. If there were no moral law, then we wouldn't be able to detect evil or injustice of any kind. What would you call evil? Maybe what I call evil is completely different, as if there's not some plumb line. Without justice, injustice is meaningless. Likewise, unless there's an unchanging standard of good, there's no such thing as objective evil. But since we all know that evil exists, then so does the moral law. And then the final proof, this all deals with, is there a moral law? This is the last one of the 8. Without a moral law, you couldn't know what was right or wrong. Some of you know, I've heard of Alan Dershowitz, who used to be a flaming liberal, and he's becoming more conservative over time, but he's a self-described agnostic. And he debated Alan Keyes, who some of you probably know as well, in September 2000 on the subject of religion in the public square. Dershowitz was asked by an audience member, what makes something right? Dershowitz praised the question and then said, we know what evil is, we've seen it. As he cited obvious examples of evil, such as the Holocaust and the Crusades, then Dershowitz peered at the audience, raised his voice and emphatically declared, I don't know what's right, but I know what's wrong. I want you to think through that for just a minute. I don't know what's right, but I know what's wrong. How do you know what's wrong? Asking the question of Dershowitz, how do you know what's wrong unless you know what's right? Indeed, you cannot know that 5 is the wrong answer to 2 plus 2 unless you have some idea of what the right answer is. Dershowitz can't know what's morally wrong unless he has some idea of what's morally right. Now, what does that say? What do these, well, all 8 of them, but what do these things say? They tell us that there is indeed a moral law. If there is a moral law, does there not have to be a moral law giver? Dale?
Unless you claim it's instinctual.
That's where we're going next. And this is the part I have trouble with. I got to tell you, how can you get here? And I can't get here. I know how they try to get here, but I'm having trouble with it. So I'm going to take you there anyhow. So what's the alternative? Right? Well, my man Norm Geisler. I wonder if it's okay with him if I call him Norm. I did get a chance to meet him, by the way, and Deborah said it's the only time in my life she's ever seen me I just kind of walked up to him and went, whoa, whoa, whoa.
You haven't evolved yet.
That's right, I hadn't evolved yet. And I'm sure I had some great comments I was going to make because I had several of his classes, but it sure didn't come out very good. So what's the alternative? Darwinist Edwin O. Wilson is a notable exception to those who question this whole issue of, can't make the point that there is such a thing as a moral lawgiver. He claims that our sense of morality has evolved in the same way we ourselves have evolved, by natural selection.
Man,
I know.
you look at our society.
While he admits that very little progress has been made in the biological exploration of moral sentiments, Wilson asserts that the biological process of people passing their genes on to their offspring through thousands of generations inevitably gave rise to moral sentiments. It's based on inherited feelings or instincts, not on an objective standard of right or wrong. Well, when I first read this, the first thing that popped into my mind was this. Why don't we pass on immoral genes as well?
Well,
Do we somehow filter those out? Dale?
Nietzsche says man is basically good,
Well,
yet that's not what we evidence.
it's pretty obvious that that's not true.
You'll tell you no.
So, and I'm going to give you two examples that he talks about. But before I do that, I promised you earlier that I'd tell you about, I got to thinking about all this, and I looked and looked. Deb got disgusted with me because I kept saying, I can't get any further than this. I can't find where this comes from. I can't make in my mind how this works. So then I got to thinking about this. If it is indeed evolutionary, if morals somehow evolved, then shouldn't we find morals today, not just in mankind, but in animals, right? Well, you might be surprised to know this. There are a bunch of them, but I found 15 animals that prey on their own people, on their own species. They prey on each other, the weakest, usually. One of which is chimpanzees, which is, who are we normally compared to? Chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees, polar bears, chickens. There's one called the sand tiger shark that begins feeding off the the weaker ones in utero. In other words, sand, whatever they're called, sharks have more than one offspring. When in utero, the stronger ones can feed off of the less strong ones. So where is the moral, where is the ethical in these strains? If it all evolved, should it have evolved equally in all? Now, let me give you two examples. Darwinists cannot explain why anyone should obey any biologically derived moral sentiment. Why shouldn't people murder, rape, and steal to get what they want if there's nothing beyond this world? Why should the powerful cooperate with the weaker when the powerful can survive longer by exploiting the weaker? After all, history is replete with criminals and dictators who have lengthened their own survival precisely because they have disobeyed all moral sentiments in their repression and elimination of opponents. So if indeed, whether it states it or not, it's the principle of survival of the fittest, what would be the reason? And one of the things I read was, part of the reason these evolved is because animals recognized that they needed to work together to hunt. First of all, why would they recognize that? Secondly, we just got through proving that that's certainly not true in at least 15 of the species. So why would it all of a sudden occur to an animal, by golly, I think we should go over here and work with these other guys to hunt? Now, there's probably instincts involved there, but I can't call those morals or ethics. Let me give you the second. Wilson says that social morals have evolved because those cooperative morals helped humans survive together. But this assumes an end, survival or for evolution.
That's the opposite, survival.
That's exactly right. Now you see why I was in such a quandary for the past couple of days, Dale? For evolution, when Darwinism, by definition, has no end because it is a non-intelligent process. There's no end to it because it's non-intelligent. And even if survival is granted as the end, Darwinists cannot explain why people knowingly engage in self-destructive behavior, drinking, drugs, suicide, etc. Nor can Darwinists explain why people often subvert their own survival instincts to help others, sometimes to the point of their own deaths. So you can now see why I just beat my head against the wall trying to come up with a way to explain how morals can evolve. I just can't get there. Dale?
This is kind of a question.
Elliot.
I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with it.
I haven't been all night, so go ahead.
Well, if morality is universal and is absolute, it's still a condition that has to be learned. Love can be learned or hate can be learned based on your environment. So we're still subject to our environment to a certain extent, even though you can find scripture that says that God's law is written on your heart. So that's kind of a perplexing question to me. Either we override our basic understanding of what morality is and seek our own desires, and then somewhere in the quagmire of life, we get redirected towards morality or away from it.
I'll buy part of what you said, which is we learn morality, but I believe we're also hardwired with the basics of morality. Our example of our 6 and 8-month-old babies prove that. Or when Sadie was little and she hit somebody or somebody hit her, did she not feel remorse? She hadn't learned remorse yet.
Probably didn't.
Well, you get the point, right?
That's part of the learning.
Well, you mentioned hardwired, and the leading atheist of today says that there is no morality, that we are hardwired into whatever we do is basically imprinted on our soul, so to speak.
You know, if
Dale?
an atheist has 2 children, and one children is always dominating the other, taking away his toys and everything, they shouldn't intervene at all. That's just the way it is. So, but yet I can't picture that being the case because of the atheist still loves both children, and they'll intervene.
Well, do you remember one of our first classes when Zach kind of helped us with presuppositions? He made the point that if you go kick an atheist daughter in the leg, do you think the atheist is going to just stand there and say, well, that's just the way things are supposed to be?
Sure. He should.
Now, let me just do a summary here, and I'm going to let my buddy Norm do it for me. When we conduct our seminar, the 12 points that show Christianity is true, the following 2 statements about morality immediately capture the attention of the audience. If there is no God, then what Hitler did was just a matter of opinion. And if at least one thing is really morally wrong, like it's wrong to torture babies, or it's wrong to intentionally fly planes into buildings with innocent people in them, then God exists. These statements help people realize that without an objective source of morality, all so-called moral issues are nothing but personal preference. Hitler liked killing people. Mother Teresa liked helping people. Unless there's a standard beyond Hitler and Mother Teresa, then no one is really right or wrong. It's just one person's opinion against that of another. Questions? I hope not, because Jerry?
I read, years ago, biography of Harry Truman. Truman was talking about, he had to make the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. And he said, he prayed about it, he thought about it. He said, sometimes in life we are presented with choices, and neither choice is good. Both of them are bad. So in his case, he had to choose the one that he felt would do the less damage. There was no good option for him. If America had invaded Japan, millions of Japanese and Americans would have died. So it was a matter of, choosing the lesser of evils.
Yeah,
We're faced with that sometimes.
we are, but you made a very important point. He knew when he was making that decision, and he knew instinctively, not just instinctively, but he knew in his heart that it was not a wrong decision, but it was the lesser of two evils. He knew it was an issue. How do you get to that point without there being someone or some being or something that instills that?
He had ethics and morals.
Yeah, so where did those come from? The same slimy pond? I'm sorry guys, I can't get you any closer than that.
I just noticed something about the book I had forgotten about. Just the foreword for the book was written by David Limbaugh.
Yeah. Rush Limbaugh's.
David Limbaugh was Rush Limbaugh's brother.
He's a lawyer also.
So, questions, comments before we do some Dale's Dailies? Janice?
I'm struggling here because I worked in human services, and I saw people that were not taught right or wrong, and when confronted with what you've done was wrong, it was,
Really? Yeah.
yeah, it was like, ah. And so in that part, I struggle with that we don't have that born, we're not born with it. But in a way, though, I do think that we do have a God-given some kind of compass within us that we're born with. But if that gets developed as we are taught, then I think that becomes stronger, and then we do it. But I just remember some situations where I couldn't believe that they wouldn't believe that what they were doing was wrong.
Let me ask you this, and it's a tough situation because I do think we do learn morals and ethics, but I think we're born with a basis for it. If, in the cases that you're talking about, were they things like, I didn't know it was against the law, or were they things like, I didn't know it was wrong to smack my kid so much that it killed him?
I think I've seen both.
Yeah.
But it's those ones where I didn't think it was wrong to do that kind of behavior. Those are the more, I can't believe they didn't know that.
Yeah.
But knowing some of them, their background, how they were raised, then they had there was no
Moral
teaching
compass.
of what's right or wrong.
And that's the argument that progressives use when somebody does bad behavior, and they rationalize it by saying that, well, they were brought up in unfortunate circumstances,